July 1948, Tempelhof Airport, West Berlin. The deafening roar of C-54 Skymaster transport planes filled the air every 3 minutes, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Lieutenant Gail Halvorsen, a 27-year-old pilot from rural Utah, wiped the sweat from his brow as he prepared for another grueling supply mission into the besieged city. Just 3 years after the guns of World War II fell silent, Berlin had become the newest battlefield of the emerging Cold War, not fought with bullets but with bread, coal, and the sheer determination of men like Halvorsen, who refused to let 2 million people starve under Soviet blockade. On his rare day off, camera in hand, Halvorsen walked toward the airport perimeter to film the endless parade of aircraft landing and departing. The Berlin Airlift, Operation Vittles, as the Americans called it, represented the largest humanitarian air operation in history, a logistical miracle that defied every military calculation. But what Halvorsen discovered that afternoon behind the barbed wire fence at Tempelhof would transform this already remarkable mission into something far more profound, a story that would echo through generations and redefine what it meant to show compassion to a former enemy. As he approached the fence, Halvorsen noticed them, approximately 30 children, their faces pressed against the wire, their eyes fixed on the magnificent aircraft overhead. These were not the aggressive, demanding children he might have expected. They stood quietly, watching with an almost reverent attention as each plane descended from the sky, carrying life itself into their dying city. Something about their dignity in the face of such desperate circumstances stopped Halvorsen in his tracks. These children, born under the shadow of Nazi tyranny and now trapped in the crucible of superpower confrontation, had learned lessons about freedom and survival that most adults would never comprehend. What happened in the next few moments would begin a chain of events that would drop 23 tons of candy from the sky, unite an entire nation in an act of spontaneous generosity, and prove that even in the darkest hours of geopolitical conflict, simple human kindness could become the most powerful weapon of all. The children told him something that struck deep into his heart. When the weather gets so bad that you can't land, don't worry about us. We can get by on a little food, but if we lose our freedom, we may never get it back. In that single statement, Halvorsen understood that these children valued something more precious than survival itself. They understood the price of liberty in ways that would shame politicians and generals on both sides of the Iron Curtain. The story of how Lieutenant Gail Halvorsen became the candy bomber begins not in the ruins of Berlin, but on the small farms of rural Utah and Idaho, where a boy with an insatiable dream of flight grew up during the Great Depression. Born on October 10, 1920 in Salt Lake City, Halvorsen learned early the values of hard work, sacrifice, and community service that would later define his most famous act. His childhood on farms in Rigby, Idaho, and Garland, Utah, taught him that even when you have little yourself, you can still find ways to help others. In September 1941, he earned his private pilot's license through the Civilian Pilot Training Program, fulfilling a dream that had consumed him since childhood. When he took his parents for their first flight, he wiggled the wings of the aircraft to signal his approach, a gesture he had no idea would one day become the signature move that would bring joy to thousands of German children. The attack on Pearl Harbor transformed Halvorsen's peaceful dream of flight into military duty. He joined the United States Army Air Forces in May 1942, entering a world at war that would test his skills and character in ways he never imagined. Throughout World War II, Halvorsen flew foreign transport operations in the South Atlantic theater, ferrying supplies and personnel across dangerous skies. He witnessed the massive destruction that modern warfare could inflict, the endless columns of refugees, the bombed-out cities reduced to rubble and ash. Like so many young Americans, he believed that when the war ended in 1945, the fighting would truly be over, that the world could finally begin to heal from the unprecedented carnage that had consumed 6 years and claimed over 60 million lives. But peace proved more elusive than victory. By 1948, the wartime alliance between the Western powers and the Soviet Union had collapsed into bitter confrontation. Germany, divided into occupation zones, became the pressure point where two incompatible visions of human society faced each other across an increasingly militarized border. Berlin, though located deep within the Soviet zone, had been divided among the four Allied powers: American, British, French, and Soviet. When the Western powers introduced a new currency in their zones in June 1948, designed to rebuild the German economy, Stalin saw an opportunity to force them out of Berlin entirely. On June 24, 1948, Soviet forces cut all road, rail, and canal access to West Berlin. The city of 2 million people was suddenly isolated with only enough food and coal to last approximately 40 days. The Western response came not with tanks and troops, but with an audacious plan that military analysts considered virtually impossible: supply an entire city exclusively by air. Lieutenant General William H. Tunner, the mastermind behind flying supplies over the Himalayas to China during the war, took command of what would become Operation Vittles, later known to history as the Berlin Airlift. The logistics were staggering. Berlin needed 4,500 tons of supplies daily just to survive, but to truly sustain the city required closer to 5,000 tons. Every calorie of food, every lump of coal, every piece of medicine and machinery would have to arrive by aircraft, flying into 3 airports in West Berlin through narrow air corridors that Soviet fighters could intercept at any moment. On July 10, 1948, Gail Halvorsen received his orders: report to Germany for transport operations in support of Operation Vittles. He arrived in a country he had never seen to help people who had been his enemies just 3 years before. The irony was not lost on him. American pilots, many of whom had flown bombing missions over Germany, were now flying around the clock to keep Germans alive. The city he found was beyond anything his rural Utah upbringing had prepared him for. Vast expanses of ruins where buildings once stood, streets lined with rubble, the haunted faces of people who had survived the apocalypse of total war only to face the possibility of slow starvation under political siege. Yet amid the destruction, he also found something unexpected: resilience, dignity, and a determination among Berliners not to surrender their freedom regardless of the cost. Halvorsen flew C-54 Skymasters, 4-engine cargo planes capable of carrying 10 tons of supplies. The operation ran with mechanical precision. Aircraft landed at Tempelhof, Gatow, and Tegel airports every 3 minutes at peak efficiency. Crews had 30 minutes to unload cargo and refuel before taking off again, maintaining a constant aerial bridge that would eventually deliver over 2.3 million tons of supplies over 15 months. The pilots called it the Milk Run, but it was anything but routine, navigating through uncertain weather, landing on bomb-damaged runways, always aware that a mechanical failure or navigation error could be fatal. By the summer of 1948, the Berlin Airlift had become more than a military operation. It was a statement of values, a declaration that the Western powers would not abandon people to tyranny, even former enemies, even at tremendous cost. The encounter that would change everything occurred on one of Halvorsen's rare days off. Like many pilots, he had developed an interest in photography and enjoyed documenting the historic operation he was participating in with his personal handheld movie camera. On this particular afternoon in late July 1948, he walked to the perimeter of Tempelhof Airport to film the endless stream of aircraft arriving and departing. The sight was mesmerizing. Every 3 minutes, another C-54 descended from the clouds, touched down with its precious cargo, and within half an hour climbed back into the sky for another load. The precision, the dedication, the sheer audacity of what they were attempting filled him with pride in what American ingenuity and determination could accomplish when motivated by humanitarian purpose rather than destruction. And as he filmed, movement near the barbed wire fence caught his attention. Approximately 30 children stood watching the aircraft, their faces pressed against the wire, completely absorbed in the aerial ballet overhead. Halvorsen's first instinct was curiosity. What drew these children to stand at the fence day after day, watching transport planes land? He walked over to talk with them, his limited German and their basic English creating a bridge across the language barrier. What struck him immediately was what these children did not do. They did not beg. They did not complain. They did not demand anything from the American pilot who had just walked up to them. Instead, they talked excitedly about the aircraft, asking questions about how the planes worked, where they came from, how much they could carry. Their fascination with the machinery of their survival revealed an innocence that the horrors of war and blockade had not completely destroyed. Then one child said something that pierced Halvorsen's heart. "When the weather gets so bad that you can't land, don't worry about us. We can get by on a little food, but if we lose our freedom, we may never get it back." The profound wisdom in those words, spoken by a child who should have been thinking about games and school rather than geopolitics and freedom, revealed the extraordinary psychological pressure under which these young Berliners lived. They had grown up under Nazi dictatorship, survived the apocalyptic final months of the war, when their city became a battlefield, endured the chaos and violence of the immediate post-war period, and now faced the prospect of Soviet occupation. Freedom was not an abstract concept to them. It was something they had watched slip away once before, and they understood with crystal clarity what its loss would mean. Touched by their dignity and wisdom, Halvorsen reached into his pocket and pulled out 2 sticks of Wrigley's chewing gum, part of his standard rations. He handed them to the children, expecting perhaps some competition or arguing over who would get the precious treat. Instead, he witnessed something that would haunt and inspire him for the rest of his life. The children who received the gum carefully broke it into pieces, sharing it among their friends. Those who did not receive any pieces did not complain. Instead, they picked up the wrappers and smelled them, savoring even the lingering scent of the gum they could not taste. The act of sharing, of finding joy in even the wrapper of a piece of gum, revealed a level of gratitude and cooperation that humbled the young American pilot. These children, who had every reason to be bitter, angry, and selfish after all they had endured, instead demonstrated a humanity that transcended their suffering. Halvorsen regretted not having more to give them. He had witnessed their response to 2 sticks of gum. What might their response be to real candy, to chocolate, to the simple sweetness that every child deserves, but which had been unavailable in Berlin for years. An idea began to form in his mind, spontaneous and unauthorized, but driven by a simple desire to bring more joy to children who had experienced so little of it in their young lives. He told them, through a combination of English, German, and hand gestures, that tomorrow he would return, and when he flew over in his plane, he would drop enough gum for all of them. He promised he would wiggle his wings as he approached, so they would know it was him, the same gesture he had used to signal his parents during his first flight back in Utah, now repurposed as a code between an American pilot and German children who had every historical reason to distrust each other, but who had instead formed an instant bond of mutual humanity. One child, practical and doubtful, asked the obvious question, "How will we know which plane is yours?" It was a reasonable concern. The sky above Tempelhof was filled with identical C-54s, all painted the same, all following the same approach pattern. Halvorsen's answer was simple: "I'll wiggle my wings." It seemed like a small thing, an easy promise to keep. What he could not have known was that this promise would grow into something that would capture the imagination of an entire nation, mobilize thousands of volunteers, and deliver over 23 tons of candy to the children of Berlin. What began as one man's spontaneous act of kindness would become Operation Little Vittles, a humanitarian mission within a humanitarian mission, demonstrating that even in the midst of geopolitical confrontation, individual acts of compassion could build bridges that politics alone could never construct. That night, Halvorsen faced a practical problem. He had made a promise to children, but he had very little candy to fulfill it. He approached his co-pilot and flight engineer and explained what he had done and what he had promised. To his relief, they immediately agreed to pool their candy rations, the small amounts of chocolate and gum that came with their standard military supplies. But even combined, the candy was quite heavy for a simple drop, and Halvorsen worried that if he just threw it out of the plane, it might injure one of the children below. He needed some way to slow its descent, to make the drop safe as well as generous. His solution was ingeniously simple. He would make parachutes. Using handkerchiefs from his personal belongings, he fashioned 3 small parachutes and attached the candy rations to them. These crude but functional parachutes would ensure that the candy floated down gently enough that no child would be hurt by falling packages, a consideration that revealed Halvorsen's essential character, his concern not just for grand gestures, but for the safety and well-being of the children he was trying to help. The next morning, as Halvorsen and his crew made their regular supply run into Tempelhof, they carried with them the 3 handkerchief parachutes loaded with candy. As they approached the airport on their landing pattern, Halvorsen spotted the children gathered near the fence exactly where he had met them the day before. True to his word, he wiggled the wings of the C-54, the massive aircraft, tilting slightly left and right, a gesture that must have seemed miraculous to the children below, as if this enormous machine had somehow recognized them personally. Then, at the right moment, the candy packages went out the window, the handkerchief parachutes blossomed open, and the precious cargo floated down toward the waiting children. For those children, watching candy descend from the sky must have seemed like something from a fairy tale, a moment of magic in a world that had contained far too much darkness and far too little wonder. The drop was a success, but for Halvorsen, it was just the beginning. He had made these children happy for one day, but why stop there? The following week, he and his crew repeated the drop, again pooling their candy rations, again fashioning parachutes from handkerchiefs, again wiggling the wings to identify themselves to the growing crowd of children below. Word had spread through the neighborhood. There was an American pilot who dropped candy from his plane, who wiggled his wings in greeting, who kept his promises. By the third week, the number of children waiting at the fence had grown significantly. What had started as a private act of kindness between one pilot and 30 children was beginning to take on a life of its own, spreading through the bomb-damaged neighborhoods of West Berlin like hope itself, drawing more and more children to the fence at Tempelhof to watch the sky for the plane with the wiggling wings. Then Halvorsen's unauthorized operation was discovered. A photograph of children scrambling for candy attached to a handkerchief parachute appeared in a West German newspaper, along with a story about the mysterious American pilot who was dropping treats to Berlin's children. The article, celebratory in tone, praised this act of spontaneous generosity, but Halvorsen knew that his commanders might take a very different view. He had been conducting an unauthorized operation, using military aircraft for purposes not outlined in his orders, potentially creating complications for an operation that depended on absolute discipline and coordination. He reported to his commander, expecting at minimum reprimand and possibly more serious consequences for his freelance humanitarian mission. To his surprise and immense relief, the response from Lieutenant General William H. Tunner, commander of the Berlin Airlift, was not punishment but expansion. Tunner immediately grasped the public relations and morale value of what Halvorsen had started. The Berlin Airlift was not just a logistical operation, it was a demonstration of Western values, a statement that democratic societies cared about human welfare even when those humans had recently been enemies. Operation Little Vittles, as Tunner named it, a playful reference to the larger Operation Vittles, would become an official part of the Berlin Airlift, with resources and coordination to expand what Halvorsen had begun on his own initiative. The order came down: continue the drops, expand them, and keep headquarters informed. Halvorsen, who had worried about being court-martialed, instead found himself at the center of what would become one of the most heartwarming stories to emerge from the early Cold War. Support for Operation Little Vittles grew with remarkable speed, first among Halvorsen's fellow pilots, then throughout the entire squadron. Pilots began pooling their candy rations, contributing to the drops that were now happening more frequently. Crews competed to make the most creative parachutes, to drop the most candy, to bring the most smiles to the children of Berlin. What had started as one man's impulse to share 2 sticks of gum had tapped into something deeper, a desire among the American servicemen to do something personal and human in the midst of a massive military operation, to connect directly with the people they were helping, rather than simply delivering anonymous tons of cargo to faceless recipients. The candy drops gave the airlift a human face, transformed statistics into stories, and turned routine supply missions into opportunities for joy and connection. As news of Operation Little Vittles reached the United States, the response was overwhelming. Newspaper and radio reports about the candy bomber captured American imagination at a time when the news from Europe was otherwise grim and threatening. Here was a story of American generosity and creativity, of turning former enemies into friends through simple kindness. The response from the American public was immediate and generous. Candy manufacturers began donating their products by the ton. Ordinary citizens mailed packages of candy and gum to support the operation, and schoolchildren across America organized drives to collect treats for the children of Berlin. By November 1948, just 3 months after the operation began, Halvorsen could no longer keep up with the volume of candy and handkerchiefs arriving from across America. The logistical challenge of managing the flood of donations required organization beyond what a flying officer could provide while maintaining his regular duties. Mary C. Connors, a college student in Chicopee, Massachusetts, offered to take charge of the now national project. She worked with the National Confectioners Association and mobilized entire communities to prepare candy and create parachutes. In Chicopee, 22 schools set aside time for students to sew handkerchiefs into miniature parachutes, with each student required to contribute 1 day per week to the effort. Churches, civic organizations, and veterans groups joined the effort, transforming Operation Little Vittles from one pilot's gesture into a nationwide expression of American humanitarian values. The former fire station in Chicopee became the center of operations where volunteers worked to prepare the approximately 100,000 parachutes that would eventually carry candy to the children of Berlin. The candy drops became daily events, then every other day occurrences, then a standard part of the airlift operation. Halvorsen was no longer the only pilot dropping candy. He was now one of many Little Vittles pilots, each contributing to what had become a massive operation within an operation. Children throughout West Berlin, not just at Tempelhof, began receiving candy from the sky. The American candy bombers became known to Berliners as the Rosinen bomber, the Raisin bombers, while Halvorsen himself acquired multiple nicknames from the children of Berlin. Uncle Wiggly Wings, his original moniker, the Chocolate Uncle, the Gumdrop Kid, and the Chocolate Flyer. Each nickname reflected the affection and gratitude that German children felt for the Americans who had transformed the terrifying sound of aircraft overhead from a herald of bombs and death into a promise of sweetness and hope. The impact of Operation Little Vittles extended far beyond the candy itself. For the children of Berlin, the handkerchief parachutes represented something more profound than chocolate and gum. They represented the idea that someone far away in a place called America knew they existed, cared about their suffering, and wanted them to smile. These children had grown up in a world of totalitarian propaganda where governments demanded absolute obedience and treated individuals as expendable units in grand ideological schemes. The fact that American pilots would take time from their grueling supply missions to think about children's happiness, to wiggle their wings in greeting, to drop treats that served no strategic purpose except joy, this demonstrated a different kind of society, a different understanding of what mattered. The candy drops became a daily reminder that freedom included the freedom to show kindness without strategic calculation, to care about individual happiness, to believe that children deserved sweetness even in the darkest times. The letters and artwork that began flowing back to the American pilots revealed the profound emotional impact of these drops. Children wrote in simple German or broken English to express their gratitude, to share their stories, to ask questions about America, and the pilots who flew the magnificent planes. They sent drawings of aircraft with wiggling wings, of parachutes descending from clouds, of smiling children catching candy packages. These letters, often written on scraps of paper because proper stationery remained a luxury in blockaded Berlin, revealed both the material deprivation and the spiritual resilience of Berlin's children. They had so little, yet they took time to say thank you, to create art, to reach out to strangers who had shown them kindness. For many American pilots, these letters became treasured possessions, reminders of why their grueling work mattered beyond tonnage statistics and flight hours. One particular correspondence would become famous, illustrating the personal connections that Operation Little Vittles created across the divide of recent enmity. A 7-year-old girl named Mercedes Wild wrote to Halvorsen expressing her love for Der Schokoladenflieger, the chocolate flyer, but she had a concern. She lived on a chicken farm, and the low-flying aircraft frightened her chickens. She worried the planes might be mistaken for hawks, terrifying her birds. Could he, she wondered, drop candy near the white chickens at her farm so she would know the delivery was specifically for her? Mercedes' letter, mixing childish concerns about her chickens with gratitude for the candy, perfectly captured the blend of ordinary life and extraordinary circumstances that defined Berlin during the airlift. Halvorsen tried to find Mercedes' white chickens on his flights, but the task proved impossible. From the cockpit of a C-54, every farm looked similar, and chickens were impossible to distinguish. Instead, he sent Mercedes candy through the Berlin mail, along with a letter explaining that while he couldn't find her chickens from the air, he wanted her to have candy nonetheless. This correspondence would have remained a minor footnote, a small kindness between a pilot and a child, except for what happened 24 years later, when Halvorsen returned to Berlin in 1970 as commander of Tempelhof Central Airport, the very airfield where he had conducted the candy drops. A German man named Peter Wild invited the new commander to dinner at his home. There, Halvorsen met Peter's wife, Mercedes. She still had the letter he had written to her in 1948, carefully preserved across more than 2 decades. She still had the chickens, now descendants of the ones she had worried about as a 7-year-old girl. The reunion, emotional and profound, illustrated how the candy drops had created connections that transcended the immediate crisis, building relationships that endured across decades and political transformations. Their story would later be immortalized in Margot Thies-Raven's children's book, Mercedes and the Chocolate Pilot, ensuring that new generations would learn about this particular friendship born from candy and handkerchiefs. Operation Little Vittles officially ran from September 22, 1948, when it became an authorized operation, to May 13, 1949, shortly after the Soviet Union ended the blockade. During those months, over 250,000 parachutes carrying over 23 tons of candy descended upon the children of West Berlin. The numbers, impressive as statistics, failed to capture the full impact of what had occurred. Each parachute represented not just candy, but a connection, a message, a reminder that individual acts of kindness mattered even in the midst of global confrontation. The children who caught those parachutes, who saved the handkerchiefs, who wrote letters of thanks, were learning lessons about democracy and freedom more profound than any propaganda could convey. They learned that American pilots cared about their happiness, that strangers could show generosity to former enemies, that the world contained kindness as well as cruelty. For Halvorsen personally, the experience transformed his understanding of his own role and responsibilities. He had begun the candy drops impulsively, without thought of publicity or recognition, simply wanting to bring joy to children who had moved him with their dignity and wisdom. The operation that grew from that impulse taught him about the power of individual initiative, the importance of human connection across national and ideological boundaries, and the profound impact that small acts of kindness could generate when combined with others' similar acts. Although he returned home in January 1949, passing leadership of Operation Little Vittles to Captain Lawrence Karski, Halvorsen understood that what he had started would continue to reverberate. Before leaving Germany, he made a point of personally thanking the people who had made the operation possible. Dorothy Groger, a homebound woman who had enlisted friends and acquaintances to sew handkerchiefs and donate funds. The schoolchildren and committee members from Chicopee, Massachusetts, who had prepared over 18 tons of candy for shipment to Germany. The countless Americans whose donations had made the operation possible. The Berlin Airlift itself stands as one of the most remarkable logistical achievements in military history. Over 15 months, Allied aircraft flew over 278,000 flights, delivering more than 2.3 million tons of supplies to the besieged city. The operation cost the lives of 78 individuals, pilots, crew members, and ground personnel who died in accidents during the relentless flying schedule. April 16, 1949, saw the peak of the airlift's achievement. 12,140 tons of supplies delivered in a single day, proving beyond any doubt that the blockade had failed and that West Berlin could be sustained indefinitely by air. On May 12, 1949, the Soviet Union lifted the blockade, reopening the roads and railways into Berlin. The airlift continued for several more months to build up supply reserves, but the crisis had passed. The Western powers had demonstrated their commitment to Berlin's freedom, and Stalin had learned that isolation tactics would not force them out of the city. Operation Little Vittles, though small compared to the massive tonnage of the main airlift, played an outsized role in the psychological victory that the Berlin Airlift represented. The candy drops gave the operation a human face that transcended geopolitics and military strategy. They demonstrated that the American presence in Europe was not about domination or revenge, but about helping people rebuild, protecting freedom, and treating even former enemies with dignity and generosity. The children who received Halvorsen's candy grew up to become some of Germany's strongest advocates for democratic values and transatlantic cooperation. They had experienced firsthand the difference between societies that valued individual happiness and those that treated humans as expendable pawns in ideological conflicts. The lessons they learned from wiggling wings and handkerchief parachutes shaped their understanding of what democracy meant in practice, not just theory. For the United States, Operation Little Vittles provided something equally valuable during the uncertain early years of the Cold War. It reminded Americans of their best values, their capacity for generosity, and their ability to transform enemies into friends through kindness rather than domination. At a time when international news consisted primarily of threatening developments and ideological confrontation, the story of the candy bomber offered hope that human decency could survive even the most bitter political conflicts. The nationwide mobilization to support the candy drops, school children making parachutes, candy companies donating their products, citizens mailing packages to support the operation, demonstrated that Americans were willing to support humanitarian efforts even when the beneficiaries were recently defeated enemies. This willingness to help former adversaries, to think of German children as children deserving of candy rather than as enemy nationals deserving of punishment, spoke to a generosity of spirit that would become central to American post-war foreign policy and the eventual reconstruction of Europe as a prosperous, democratic region. Gail Halvorsen's military career continued long after he left Berlin in January 1949, but the candy drops would forever define his legacy. The young lieutenant who had spontaneously promised candy to children at a fence went on to become a full colonel, serving in increasingly responsible positions throughout his 31-year military career. He earned bachelor's and master's degrees in aeronautical engineering from the University of Florida, worked on space projects including the Titan III launch vehicle program, and even helped develop plans for advanced manned, reusable spacecraft, the early conceptual work that would eventually lead to the space shuttle. In 1970, he returned to Berlin as commander of Tempelhof Central Airport, the very airfield where he had conducted the candy drops 22 years earlier. The symbolism was not lost on Berliners, who welcomed him back not as a military commander, but as an old friend, the pilot who had shown them kindness when they needed it most. Throughout his later years, Halvorsen advocated for replicating the candy drops in other conflict zones and struggling regions. He understood that the impact of Operation Little Vittles extended beyond the specific historical circumstances of the Berlin blockade. It demonstrated a principle that applied wherever children faced hardship and uncertainty. In 1994, he persuaded the Air Force to let him drop hundreds of candy bars over Bosnia-Herzegovina as part of Operation Provide Promise, bringing moments of sweetness and hope to children trapped in the Balkans conflict. Additional drops followed in Kosovo in 1999, as well as in Japan, Guam, Albania, and numerous locations across the United States. After the 2003 invasion of Iraq, Halvorsen advocated for candy drops over Baghdad, arguing that they could provide a ray of hope, a symbol that somebody in America cares for Iraqi children caught in yet another conflict, not of their making. The United States military adopted variations of his approach, dropping toys, teddy bears, and soccer balls to Iraqi children, continuing the tradition that Halvorsen had pioneered over Berlin 6 decades earlier. Halvorsen's humanitarian work included numerous return visits to Germany, where he participated in anniversary commemorations of the Berlin Airlift. On the 20th anniversary in 1969, he helped reenact one of his famous candy drops at Tempelhof with over 40,000 people in attendance. Another reenactment occurred in September 1989 to commemorate the 40th anniversary, this time with a television crew from Good Morning America documenting the event. Remarkably, some of the children who caught the candy drops were now grandparents themselves, and their grandchildren had the opportunity to catch candy from the same pilot who had brought joy to their grandparents' generation. In 1998, at age 77, Halvorsen served as a regular flight crew member on the Berlin Airlift Historical Foundation's C-54 Spirit of Freedom, participating in a 71-day European tour that included 2 Atlantic Ocean crossings in the then 53-year-old aircraft. He continued to fly with the Foundation and perform candy drops until just after his 99th birthday, with his last flight on December 17, 2019. The awards and recognition that Halvorsen received over his lifetime reflected the profound impact of what he had started with 2 sticks of gum and a promise to children at a fence. In 1949, he received the Cheney Award from General Hoyt S. Vandenberg, recognizing his humanitarian action in founding Operation Little Vittles. In 2014, he received the Congressional Gold Medal, the highest award Congress can bestow on a civilian, presented to him at age 93. Germany honored him with the Grand Cross of the Order of Merit of the Federal Republic of Germany in 1974, the highest award that nation could bestow, recognizing his contribution to German-American relations. In 2015, he received the General Lucius D. Clay Medal from the Federation of German-American Clubs, the highest honor for contributions to German-American relations. Schools in Germany were named in his honor, including a secondary school in Berlin and the Gail S. Halvorsen Elementary School at Rhein-Main Air Base in Frankfurt. He appeared on numerous television programs in both America and Germany, often reunited with individuals who had caught his candy drops as children and wanted to express their enduring gratitude. Halvorsen's personal life reflected the same values of service and dedication that characterized his military career. He married Halte Jolly on April 16, 1949, shortly after returning from Germany. They had met in 1942 at Utah State Agricultural College, and their courtship continued via mail during his deployment. Together, they raised 5 children, while Halvorsen fulfilled military assignments across the United States and Germany. After his retirement in 1974, they moved to Provo, Utah, where Halvorsen served as Assistant Dean of Student Life at Brigham Young University from 1976 until 1986. Both he and Alta were active members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, serving as missionaries in London from 1986 to 1987 and in St. Petersburg, Russia, from 1995 to 1997. Alta died in 1999, and Halvorsen later married his high school sweetheart, Lorraine Pace, living with her on their farm in Spanish Fork, Utah, until his death. Gail Halvorsen died on February 16, 2022, at age 101, having lived long enough to see the Cold War won, the Berlin Wall fallen, Germany reunified, and the children he had dropped candy to become grandparents and great-grandparents themselves. His funeral included full military honors with a flyover by a KC-135R of the Utah Air National Guard's 151st Air Refueling Wing. Berlin Mayor Franziska Giffey stated, "Halvorsen's deeply human act has never been forgotten." In June 2022, Senator Mike Lee proposed legislation to rename the Provo Vet Center in Halvorsen's honor, and the facility was rededicated on November 21, 2022. The Gail S. Halvorsen Aviation Education Foundation, established in 2016, continues his legacy by promoting aviation and STEM education among young people, ensuring that future generations will learn not just about the technical achievements of flight, but also about the humanitarian purposes to which aviation can be dedicated. The story of the candy bomber is ultimately about a simple but revolutionary idea that kindness matters even in the midst of geopolitical conflict, even between former enemies, even when strategic considerations might suggest that humanitarian gestures are irrelevant luxuries. Gail Halvorsen's spontaneous decision to share 2 sticks of gum with 30 children at a fence grew into an operation that dropped 23 tons of candy from over 250,000 parachutes, mobilized thousands of volunteers across America, and demonstrated to the world that democracy meant more than political systems and economic theories. It meant valuing individual happiness, caring about children's smiles, and treating even former adversaries with dignity and generosity. The timing of Operation Little Vittles was particularly significant. The Berlin Airlift occurred at the beginning of the Cold War, when the fault lines of the post-war world were hardening into decades of confrontation between incompatible visions of human society. In this context, the candy drops served as a powerful counter-narrative to the increasingly militarized and ideological nature of international relations. While politicians and generals focused on tonnage statistics, air corridors, and strategic implications, Halvorsen and the thousands who supported him insisted that human connections mattered, that children deserved sweetness regardless of their nationality, and that small acts of kindness could have strategic importance by winning hearts and minds in ways that military force never could. For the children of Berlin, who caught those handkerchief parachutes, the experience shaped their entire understanding of what democracy and freedom meant. They learned that American pilots cared about their happiness, that strangers could show generosity without expecting anything in return, and that the frightening roar of aircraft overhead could bring joy rather than terror. Many of these children grew up to become some of Germany's strongest advocates for democratic values and transatlantic cooperation, their political views shaped by childhood memories of wiggling wings and chocolate descending from clouds. When the Berlin Wall fell in 1989, 40 years after the airlift ended, the generation that had caught Halvorsen's candy drops played significant roles in the peaceful revolution that reunified Germany and ended the Cold War division of Europe. The broader lesson of the candy bomber extends beyond the specific circumstances of post-war Berlin. Halvorsen's story reminds us that individual initiative matters, that one person's decision to act with kindness can inspire others and generate impacts far beyond anything originally imagined. He began dropping candy without authorization, without a plan, without considering the potential complications or consequences. He simply saw children who needed joy and decided to provide it. That spontaneous generosity, multiplied through the participation of thousands of Americans who donated candy, made parachutes, and supported the operation, demonstrated the power of grassroots humanitarian action. The operation succeeded not because of government directives or strategic planning, but because ordinary people chose to participate in something that felt right and human. In 2021, at age 100, shortly before his death, Halvorsen reflected on the meaning of Operation Little Vittles. Everyone needs hope today as much as the West Berliners needed it then. Hope is a universal need. My experience on the airlift taught me that gratitude, hope, and service before self can bring happiness to the soul when the opposite brings despair. These words, spoken at the end of a century-long life, captured the essential wisdom that his experience had taught him, that serving others, showing gratitude, and maintaining hope, even in difficult circumstances, represented not just moral virtues, but practical necessities for human happiness and social cohesion. The candy bomber's legacy lives on in multiple forms: in the aviation education programs supported by the foundation established in his name, in the schools and facilities named to honor his memory, in the ongoing tradition of humanitarian airdrops to children in conflict zones, and most importantly, in the memories of the thousands of individuals whose lives he touched through a simple act of sharing candy with children who had learned to value freedom more than food. His story reminds us that heroism comes in many forms, sometimes in the courageous actions of soldiers in battle, but sometimes in the simple decision of a pilot to wiggle his wings and drop chocolate to children who needed hope as much as they needed bread. In the end, Gail Halvorsen proved that the sound of freedom could be the wiggle of wings and the rustle of handkerchief parachutes carrying sweetness from the sky.